Al and I were looking at different places of interest to go and to see, and then when I was looking through the newspaper, I came across the American Clock and Watch Museum in Bristol, Connecticut. And I said to Al, I said, I think this is a place we'd really like to go and be able to show to our community. And when we made the phone call, we were put in contact with Jennifer.
Well, I welcome you both and all the viewers at home, of course.
If you could tell us your position here.
Yes, as executive director, we're a very small staff and working as a small nonprofit in the area, but my position is working on future planning for programs and events and work with membership and development. The American Clock and Watch Museum is a nonprofit educational and research organization, and we're dedicated to promoting the history of American-made clocks and watches for the general public. We have a lot of clock enthusiasts, clock and watch enthusiasts who come to visit us, but also a large portion of our visitation is the general public. And this year, 2012, marks the 60th anniversary of the American Clock and Watch Museum in Bristol. And it began in 1952. It was established by Edward Ingram, who was the president of the E. Ingram Company in Bristol. And at the time, there were only two companies, Sessions and Ingram, that were producing clocks. And as Edward Ingram said, it was sort of the end of the heyday of clockmaking, and he was sort of noticing that and had become a clock collector, and some of his friends as well got this group together and they established the museum. And then the next step was to find a home for it. They had debated whether or not to make it part of the Ingram Company, but what they ended up doing is that the company donated funds so that they could purchase the Miles Lewis House, which is where we have been located since 1954. So when visitors first come to the museum, the first thing they see is this 1801 Federal-style home, and what's important is that the early founders of the museum really wanted an early American setting for these early American clocks that they were donating to the collection. So the Miles Lewis House, built in 1801 in the Federal Hill District of Bristol, became the home. Later, as more and more donations were occurring, by 1956 they built the Barnes Wing, which is where we're standing right now, and you actually use salvage from one of the earliest houses in Bristol, 1728, and it was a Barnes family house. So they were able to use salvage for a lot of what we see in this room. And then later on, again, adding the Ingram Wing, which is another addition. And there's always talk of how we're going to expand into the future, so you never know how large the place is going to get. But so I think with that, we can go and meet the curator. Tom Grimshaw is our curator, and he can give us a more in-depth look at the history of clock and watchmaking.
Okay, that sounds excellent. Hi, Tom. It's nice meeting you. I'm Susan Grimaldi. Nice to meet you.
And thank you to Al and Sue coming to our museum. We have a wonderful museum here, which we are very happy and very pleased that you came down to showcase us. We have over 2,200 clocks in the collection, and we have over 3,500 watches. And what we try to do is tell the story of America's contribution to not only America's watch and clock making, but the world's clock and watchmaking, which we were very influential. The story is here. We've been talking about the development of the wooden gear tall case clock, the shelf clock, but there was soon to be sort of the death knell of the wooden gear clock. It had problems. It had problems in shipping. You couldn't export it. Wood you had to season it. It would break. They made each gear out of a single piece of wood so that each part of a gear made had the grains running horizontally, and those would break first. They should have actually been triangulated and only worked on the horizontal part of the grain, but that would have been too expensive. So for all those reasons, and they were bulky, and they had to be run by weights. So they were practical for their day, but the era was soon to change, and the change would come because brass would become available, and for the first time would become available in quantities and in price that you could make a less expensive competitive clock to the wooden gear clocks, and we'll go through that part. Actually, brass in America was put to use, but never in any quantity. This example is one of the rarest of the early examples. It was done by Joseph Ives when he was in Brooklyn, New York. The clock was his invention, and it has several things that were far beyond its day in American horology. Number one, this is not only brass, it is wrought brass, which means that it's from rolled brass, which is so much cheaper than trying to take a cast iron or cast brass and work it into various parts. This was wrought brass. This was done in 1818. This clock had a very, very poor movement design, and we don't really know if it ever ran well at all. There's very little wear on this. Now, I don't know if you can get a close-up of the teeth on this, but they're square. They're not even the right shape, and that produces extra friction. So he had to make what are called rolling pinions, which those teeth engage and they will roll to offset the increase in friction. This is designed with too many gears in the train. The great wheels at the bottom, which are usually large, are tiny. So there's very little torque being delivered to each of the strike train and the time train. The other thing that was very innovative about this was it was not powered by coiled springs. It was not powered by weights. It was powered by these leaf springs, which he went on to use all the way into the 1840s and even into the 1850s. This was his particular invention. These would be wound up, and as the clock winds up, these leaves come up, and then as they descend, they power the clock. And they do provide a tremendous amount of torque. Obviously, this clock was expensive. Couldn't compete. You couldn't mass produce anything like this. So it was kind of like the first bird of spring. Mm-hmm. You know, it was a little peek into the future. And today, these are very collectible. We know that some of these that were around, because the movements didn't work well, the movements were replaced. This is an example that survives with its original movement. This is very rare, and we are so happy to have one of this.
Now, does that face open up this way here?
Yeah,
this way Al could get maybe a little better shot at it without any reflection of the glass.
Yeah, even to make this thing work, you see, he had to take this bottom part of the plate and bend it out, so you'd have the winding drum. There'd be a space for the cord to wind on. Joseph Ives was, like Terry, an inventive genius. Unlike Terry, he was not a businessman. He was in debt several times. He never made money. If he would have patented the process for the wrought brass, he could have retired wealthy. He was one of these guys that was a mechanic, a genius, and was only interested in that, and business was not his forte, to his detriment. The report is that he was so well liked that when he was reportedly in debtor's prison, his competition bought him out and brought him back because he had so many ideas, is the story. Whether that's totally true or not, I haven't seen it authenticated, but that's the story that we've grown up with. So this is the beginning of American brass used in a movement in a production Connecticut type clock. And we say Connecticut type even though it wasn't made in Brooklyn, as he was from Bristol. He made tall case wooden gear clocks. He was a Bristol person, got in trouble, went down in Brooklyn and made the clock there, and then came back and had an even bigger impact on the clock industry. But even this, if you can get a close-up of that latch, notice how decorated it is.
Yeah, I can see that.
Everything on this clock was top class. In 1830, I mean, everybody knew brass was superior to wood as a quality product to produce something that would wear and last and so forth. And in 1830, Joseph Ives is back in Bristol. He gets together with his nephew, and they form a company along with others, and they start to make a different, very different kind of clock. Still weight driven, and it appears in this large case in the back on the left. And it's like in 3 sections, and that's why it's called the triple-decker clock. This was made in large quantity. Probably 3,000 of these were made over the years. And it was mass-produced. One of its great advantages is that it was an 8-day clock, not a 30-hour clock. What's inside this clock is Joseph Ives' invention of the strap wrought brass movement done in 1830. So we come from the Brooklyn era back to Bristol. He invents this thing. It's a massive thing. Remember the little wheels on
Yes.
this other? Well, he gets rid of the little wheel syndrome. He gets these massive wheels to provide all this torque. He's still using square cut teeth rather than the rolled over proper shape. But the clock works. And again, he's using rolling pinions. And what a rolling pinion is where the teeth engage. These little pieces of metal actually revolve inside these 2 collets. And that makes it have less friction and allows the clock to run. And again, if Joseph Ives would have just patented the wrought brass strap design and so forth, he probably would have been very economically successful. But he didn't. He was a mechanic. He made some money in 1830, actually. He did pretty well with that particular company. And that became direct competition to the wooden gear clocks. And it was the beginning of the end for the wooden gear clocks. The wooden gear people countered by making 8-day wooden gear clocks, which was not all that practical. They got copied. Jerome comes out with a similar style case, and R&J.B. Terry do, and there's all this competition with these very large Empire triple-decker clocks designed by Elias Ingram. So you start to see how all of these people were in competition. All of them knew each other. Many of them sat in the same church. So they knew what was going on in every part of the factory, everything that was happening. So there were no secrets here in Bristol during that period of time. But the real innovation and the thing that was more dramatic happened about 9 years later. We had a panic, a financial meltdown in 1837. Now, interestingly, looking back at it, the cause of that depression was excess credit on speculation in land. It's not like we ever learn anything.
I was just thinking that.
So the clock industry went in a tailspin. Companies went bankrupt. Jerome is down in Virginia trying to collect debts, get money. His account in his autobiography, and he was a self-promoter, said, I had this vision of producing a cheap one-day brass clock that would undersell the wooden gear 30-hour clock. And he came back, and his brother, who we really don't know who trained him, but he was the movement designer. And Noble Jerome, with supposedly the supervision of his brother, designed a movement that was the most practical, simple, inexpensive brass movement ever made, and it went on to produce millions of these clocks. And we show the actual prototype of it here in the center. Now notice that the dial has a big hole in it.
Yes.
Why do you think that was?
I think it's just so you can see the actual movements being there, showcasing the technology, the development.
This is not a wooden gear cheap clock. This is a brass high quality clock. Not only is this all brass, these are mirror polished.
I can see, yes.
You can actually, if you hold one up to your face, you can see your face in it. This front piece, the solid escape wheel, these wheels are visible, all are solid, so that you can tell that this is a brass clock. No question about it. It was a self-advertising thing. In the next generation of these, they kept these solid and then spoke the back ones because you couldn't see them. But this was the original prototype. Count wheel, and it's held on with a clip, which is so much easier to make than integrating it with the great wheel. A tremendously cost-saving device and design. There are approximately 14 individual pieces to put together on this clock. There's nothing that's been ever simpler. And this was also a clock that even the backyard mechanic couldn't destroy it by trying to fix it. They absolutely were super practical. The case became and was changed into a design, and this movement was only changed at the beginning by spoking out the wheels. And they put it in the cheapest case, or least expensive case that they could think of to house the movement, and it became what is called the OG clock, which is the box clock on the lower right in this display. Now, the genius of this was that for the first time, you could export these things. The brass wasn't going to warp or do anything like that. And this, we're now talking about 1839. By 1841, they've got the design of the case down. They've got the movement. Everything's in place. Jerome sends an entire boatload of these things over to England and prices them at, I think it was $4.75, less than $5. Now, the English government said no clock could be built anywhere near that price, and they confiscated the entire lot, opened up clock shops, and sold them. What do you think Jerome did next? Sent over another boatload and a third boatload. By the late 1800s, the timekeeper of England was the Jerome lowly OG clock. It was on more shelves in England than any other clock, and it literally destroyed what are agreed upon by the finest horologic clock industry was in England. And this clock basically very much hurt it and almost destroyed the guild. Now, the one thing about Europe, and we're going to be talking about this when we get into the watches, there were guilds there. There were things you could do, and there were things you couldn't do. In America, it was open season. You could do anything you want. You could design a case with leaf springs. Nobody's going to say that doesn't meet guild standards. You could build a clock like this. No one stepped in and said, no, you can't do that. That would hurt us. No, it was open competition, open design, anything goes, let the market decide, and the market decided in favor of Chauncey Jerome. Jerome eventually became the biggest clockmaker in Connecticut, the most successful, had the largest house in New Haven, and after he retired from the operations of the company made a deal with another very famous Connecticut person and became bankrupt. And that famous person was P.T. Barnum. And each one blames the other. And in reading the autobiography, I would have to side with Chauncey Jerome. I think he was out of the operations. The person that signed the contract, it ruined them both, bankrupted them both. So the story of Jerome, and the title that we use with him is Rags to Riches to Rags. He ended up in Austin, Illinois, assembling movements of his OG design, and died virtually penniless. It was quite a story. So this was the next great development. This propelled America worldwide. This is what helped get America out of the 1837 Depression, and Connecticut becoming one of the central manufacturing states in the country. Were the clock people. This invention and others like it that were soon to follow just exploded the clock industry. And we're going to go next and look a little bit at this particular panel. Well, this is a small display about some of the artwork that's contained in these clocks. One of the things that clock people marvel at is how the general art community does not recognize the artwork that is in these clocks. We believe that they are truly folk art. These were generally untrained people. These were generally women that did the work. I always say if a commercial weather vane is considered folk art, why aren't these true reverse paintings that we see in these clocks considered folk art? They were done by untrained artists, self-taught, basically artists with some mentoring from others that had been doing it. And an example of reverse work is up in the upper right-hand corner. Now this is a stenciled glass, and the stencil had to be cut out right to the left of it. And that is the stencil that created the glass by Fenn. Fenn was one of the most important glass makers of this era. And in the Pillar and Scrolls, you saw all reverse painted tablets.
Yeah, they were stunning.
Right. And we say reverse because when you paint a regular picture, you paint the background and then you come forward and paint the foreground. In reverse glass painting, it's done absolutely the opposite. You paint the front, the faces and the people and the stuff that is at the front, and the background comes last. As Ginger Rogers said about Dancing with Fred Astaire, I got to do everything backwards and I got to do it in high heels. and we're in the same boat here. This was not an easy process. And of course these flake. And we do have restorers today that are skilled in the restoration of these reverse painted glasses, both filling in and just touching up missing pieces, and in painting totally new ones if the whole thing has been destroyed.
I'm just surprised that they didn't recognize the artwork there, because that's one of the things that I saw throughout the different clocks as we were going along.
And the carvings.
Right.
Those carvings, we have a workbook that the carved eagle splat, and in the book it says basically for 1/2 hour's work. They took a solid piece of wood and carved these beautiful eagle splats for these clocks in a half an hour.
Wow.
And we saw one, in this previous panel. All this carving, all the carved feet, all the carved columns, all the carved designs, and some of them are absolutely spectacular. And they're, as we say, if we took them and sold them by the individual carving, if we put them on a clock, they go down in value. It's true. It's actually true. We've seen these dials, for example, which were painted by women. We've seen these sold for more than the entire clock at a clock auction, just for the dial, and sold as early artwork from the first 20 years of the 18th century or 1800s. So all this artwork is here, and there's a whole study on it that has gone on with who painted the glasses and trying to find out. Most of them, especially the women, were never identified, which is a shame that nobody recorded what was going on at that particular time. So we wanted to touch base with here, and then we want to come with kind of the final development of the American clock, except for one, which we're going to go downstairs and see.
Okay.
And so we'll move on over to the next great American jump that allowed the clocks to be even more practical, more exportable, and went all over the world as well. We kind of come into the last phase of the first half century of the 1800s and the Connecticut clock development. And everything that we've talked about up to this point has been driven, another power source, except for the leaf springs that were used in very few clocks, by weights. The weights have to have enough fall to run the clock for either 30 hours or 8 days. So they're fairly big clocks. And in 1836, a clock came on the market which was radically different, an American clock, mass-produced, which was very different from anything that had been produced before. And the reason that it could be built is because we finally developed a process to manufacture a coiled spring to drive the clock. And the first example in any quantity of a coiled spring clock being developed in America was this little beehive clock. It runs 8 days on a winding. Now, if you compare this clock, and we set next to it one of those triple deckers, big face, large case, this probably was more expensive. So if you went into a clock shop, which you could probably have at that time, and you saw all these big clocks, and then you saw this little thing and plain, just this beehive case, and it was equal to or more money, it probably didn't look like value, and it didn't sell well. And then the 1837 depression hit. So the clock went out. But what it did do is it proved that a coiled spring, and here is a coiled spring, and it's encased in cast iron cups. And the reason it was cased in cast iron cups is brass was not a typical thing that a coiled spring would be made of, and they were afraid of it breaking because brass was soft. And therefore, they didn't want the spring to break and go up into the movement and damage the clock. So they encased them in these very expensive cast cups, which caused the price to go up. The other thing about the spring was, the tighter you wind a spring, the more torque it delivers. And to offset that particular fact is we have these fusees. And as the clock winds up, this offsets the power so that the power is equal over a longer period of time and will run the clock more accurately. These are called fusees, and they
Wait, excuse me 1 second. When you're saying fusees, why are they? Because of the fact that they're different layers, levels, or?
They're different levels. As you wind up, the force is the distance delivered by how far out it is from the center.
Okay.
It's like a teeter-totter. The farther out you sit on the teeter-totter, the more force you have, and you can lift more weight. The same thing applies here, that the further you get to the outside, the more torque is either subtracted or added, depending if it's a reverse or direct fusee. But in this particular case, this allows the clock to run more evenly because the power delivered to the movement is more standardized. by this fusee design. And this had been used on, for example, English watches for a very long time. And it was nothing new. This design was a little different, and this was developed by Charles Kirk, who was another guy like Joseph Ives in that he was an inventive genius and always broke. Now, this particular beehive clock was first made, we believe, in 1835. The Depression hit in 37. We have documents where somebody as late as 1841, they're replying to the request and they say, well, we still have some of the movements. You can buy the movement if you wish. So they didn't sell out, and they were a difficult, it was too expensive, and the clock was not successful. But it showed that America could make a coiled spring clock.
This looks really, yeah, it looked like it was very, very heavy.
Well, if you feel this clock, it weighs a ton.
Yeah, okay, yeah, don't trust it to my hands.
And that's the weight of the springs, the weight of the cast iron, and so forth. The next invention that came up was Kirk's patent movement. Now, this clock was built at E.C. Brewster. Not E.C. Brewster and Company, but E.C. Brewster. After the Depression, Elias Ingram was in trouble financially. And probably the most famous story about him happens fairly quickly. He asks for his wife, bring me my winter coat. She dutifully brings him the winter coat. The odd part of it is, it's August. He walks out the door. He goes to Venezuela. Apparently didn't tell her where he was going. She said she never forgave the you-know-what for doing that. Probably had kids and everything. And on the way back, he says, I designed in my mind and whittled an example of a new style case that I think will sell. The reason he went to Venezuela is because he wanted to see if he could open up markets to sell his clocks. So he goes down to Venezuela and see if there's a market. He comes back, and what he had whittled out was one of the most famous design cases of all time, which was the steeple clock. This is the first example with these little spheres on the top of these cones. We believe that it is the first steeple made in America. It does have some, I don't want to say stealing a design, but the English had developed cases that were somewhat similar along these lines. But this sharp Gothic, or the steeple case that Ingram designed, was fairly unique. In there was a movement designed by Kirk again, and it's hard to see, but if you looked at the back plate of this movement, if we took it out, the entire thing is cast iron. And again, it was to house the cups and to house the springs in these cups and make sure that if the spring broke, because they're brass springs, that it wouldn't damage the movement. This clock, we made probably in around 1841 or so, became one of the most copied clocks of all time. Steeple clocks were sold by the millions. And this was another Ingram design. So Ingram starts to traverse the 1830s, and now he's into the 1840s, and he's still developing these new designs that these manufacturers could sell. Now the clock next to it was made in 1845. Who comes back on the scene but Eli Terry? And Terry was trained in brass, as we mentioned before. And he was really retired. He had a clock shop in the back of his house, and he was always experimenting. And he designed this particular clock, which was built by his youngest son, S.B. Terry. And it's called the S.B. Terry balance wheel. And in a way, it's kind of a precursor, in some sense, to the marine clock. Mm-hmm. And the advantage to this clock is this runs on any position. You can tip it and it'll keep running.
Wow.
Because it's a balance wheel. It's not a pendulum. You could hang this on the wall. You could put it in, have it off kilter, and it would still run. So probably, I haven't tried this, but if we hooked it up to a wall on a big ship, it would probably keep going. And that's why they were called marine balance wheel clocks. Eventually what happens later on is Kirk, who was at the E.C. Brewster and E.C. Brewster and Company, takes this development of the balance spring clock and really expands it into a major force in the clock inventory of American clocks to sell. Never made any money off of it, always bankrupt again, always undercapitalized. But these are the kind of the precursors to that particular development. The unusual thing about this example is, number one, is this fabulous original tablet in it, which is one of the most striking geometrics that we know of. It's absolutely gorgeous. And the second thing is it's running. And I grew up with the cartoon Rube Goldberg. Mm-hmm. This was Rube Goldberg. How this thing, why it works is unbelievable, and most of them don't work, but this one is functioning properly, and really was never developed into anything directly, but started to establish the marine clock business in the United States. Here what we're going to do is we're going to visit a couple other areas of the museum for the next design changes. A couple, again, except for the calendar clocks, the basic structure of the movement was now standardized. Variations of all kinds, but basically, if you've seen one, you understand all of the others. And it was who could produce the best piece of matching furniture. One of Elias Ingram's patents, as we said, he designed more cases, and these came along later in the 1800s, 1870s and 80s. And what he patented was the door with two circles, one circle over the dial, one circle for the glass, and these two rosettes. And he took out a patent on that, and nobody could violate the patent. But given American ingenuity during the same period of time, this is also Noah Pomeroy. Notice what he did. He had the circle, he had the two rosettes, but he squared off the bottom and kept the top part round. That got around the patent. The Atkins people, the Welch people, got around the patent by having the upper circle, the two rosettes, but they made the door with an octagon shape rather than a circle. So given American ingenuity to get around any patents, this is an exact example of how you would do that. Now it was interesting because I'm surprised that Pomeroy was not allowed to use this door, because Pomeroy made the movements for the Ingram factory for quite a few years, and so they absolutely were working together. But for some reason, Pomeroy felt that he could not use the patented door, and made this variant. So this is the history of these types of things that went on in competition with the American clock industry during the 1800s.
I never would have realized that there was so much competition, so much patent infringement until we had this tour today.
Right. Well, it was a business, and you tried to stay in business. Many of the clock factories were not capitalized well. There was also a tremendous number of fires. If you can imagine the finishing of the clocks, you had alcohol with shellac. Mm-hmm. And fires are been reported in the Bristol press for right through the history, And of course, you had sawdust, and I mean, you had a perfect and wood construction for the
Perfect environment, sure.
perfect environment for fires. So it was a tough business. Elias Ingram went bankrupt 3 different times until he really hit it big as a 55-year-old industrialist in Connecticut. And then from that point forward, right up until the 1950s, the company survived, and in some of those eras thrived. So there was a long legacy of Elias Ingram companies here in Bristol, but he paid an enormous price, to get to be successful. We mentioned Ives was bankrupt. Many companies had troubles. So it was a very competitive marketplace. And the survivors ended up to be the Seth Thomas Clock Company, went to the 50s, the Sessions went to the 50s, the Ingrams went to the 50s, and basically everybody else was out before that. So it was, time passes on, as we say,
Yep.
and the competition takes its toll. And
Speaking of matching furniture, I was looking at that clock that's right behind there, and the beautiful woodwork that's all involved there.
yeah, this particular clock, the story goes, this was supposedly designed and given to the directors of one of the clock companies, and they only made 12 of them. We don't know if that's for sure, but as far as the example of an empire case, this clock probably exemplifies the design to a greater extent than any particular empire clock made. It's just bold. It's just the veneering on this, the matching veneers. This is a miraculous case. All of the bent work, and if anybody has ever worked with crotch mahogany, they know how brittle that is. And you look at this clock, and there isn't a break on it. It's a marvel of a case execution of a very difficult wood, and the ability of these guys to do this kind of work back in that era still astounds us. As we were saying, it became a contest of who could produce the best furniture. We see the steeples repeated again, and was a very popular design. This one on the front has rippling on it, and that was done by a machine. And they actually, a person back in 1970 reinvented the machinery to cut this rippling. And this was extra added feature and is a desirable collecting tribute to a particular case. Here you see again Ingram's, this is Brewster and Ingram's steeple as it evolved. And here you see the 4 posters. The beautiful Fen tablet that we saw, the Fen stenciling. This is the same kind of a tablet. This became very popular. We move on into the future, into the late 1800s, and we start to see this kind of a clock change in design, and we're going toward parlor clocks and what we call kitchen clocks. They were the clock of the day. If you get a 1903 Sears catalog, you'll see these for sale, at $6.75. The one up here with the man's face on it is more desirable because that's called a commemorative. It was an Ingram product. The actual roller that made the face is from the factory, and that's the face that's on that particular clock, and all of that design was done by machine. They softened the plates, they rolled the plates through presses, and they pressed that design into the oak. And we often say that there must have been a contest because some of these really got ugly. and we wondered, who dreamt this one up? And this was the beginning of the end of the mechanical clock. And what we're going to go next is to see what that end looked like. In this is the last panel of the exhibit in this particular room. And what this demonstrates is the great variety of clocks that America produced. And for example, when you look at this Ansonia clock, This is a very desirable model, and this was literally stolen from the French. And it's a mystery clock because the clock runs, but there is no known mechanism to drive it. And what it is a miniaturized movement up in here with its own pendulum. And the way the arm is constructed, the pendulum up here drives the whole arm back and forth. So this was made by Ansonia, and very, very popular. But the French had been making these for a long time. And the statues, the former curator, Chris Bailey, told me that he has seen the actual identical statues in France, as what Ansonia copied. We also have more Ingram clocks. This is the corrugated gallery clock. This is a later period. We're talking 70s and 80s. We see the Grecian with the mosaic base, and also the sub-miniature Venetian. And we're going to talk about this clock later. This is the smallest version of the Venetian, and we call this the sub-miniature. There's a miniature and a sub-miniature. There's actually 5 different sizes of this design. But what we really wanted to show, finishing up here, was the major events that the clock industry went through, and sort of what became the standard common clock of the day. And the first one I'm going to pick up here is this adamantine case. These were started in the 1880s. And this was made to directly mimic a French marble clock. And this is very light, and it's obviously got a wood base. Some of these were painted black and enameled and finished to make it look like marble. Seth Thomas developed an adamantine case, which was a plastic that was used over the surface of the wood. And this became the clock of the day from roughly 1895 right on through probably 1910. They were still selling them, 15 even. And they became very decorative and very highly designed, and these were made by the multi-millions. When I started collecting clocks back in 1971, we were buying these for between $1 and $2.50.
Well, I noticed even the detail inside there where they put down made Seth Thomas Clock Company, and then it says made in the USA.
Right.
In Thomaston.
And this was all stamped out. This was all Americanized and cheapened up. And but it had the look, and
Oh, it looks beautiful.
the lions on the side and the gilded feet, and the whole business.
I'll tell you what, I'll give you $5 for it. You'll really make a big return on your
Well-
money. How's that?
We'll take it. They've gone up.
I figured as much.
Not to a great deal, but they've gone up. The last real case development was what we call the camelback or the humpback. And these were made from roughly very late 1800s, right on through, you see them in the 20s and in the 30s in the catalogs. And these came both in a myriad of different little changes to this basic design. But this was what was on America's mantle for probably 3 decades, and up until World War II. And all during this time, one of the things we haven't talked about was the development of the Henry Warren electric motor, which brought into case, we started to see the electrics intrude on the mechanicals. But when the factories converted to war effort, all the clock factories had to convert, and after the war was over, the mechanical clock, basically as an industry, was really on the wane. And all the equipment was old. They hadn't updated. It hadn't been used, some of it, for a long period of time. The electrics were coming in, and that was the death knell of the mechanical clock that Connecticut had played such a huge part of. More clocks came out of Connecticut than any other state in the Union. and a lot of it developed right here in Bristol. Ansonia, Waterbury, New Haven was the mecca for the mechanical clock. And we kind of call this the last of the Mohicans. But we still have people today that are making clocks, many of them super high quality, and they're pieces of artwork more than they are a clock. And there's still a market for that type of clock. But essentially, as a staple for a business to run, this was the end of the mechanical clock.
Now, just for curiosity, because of the design of it, what type of material is this one? I noticed it had the design. At first, I was thinking, we're from East Long Meadow and they do brownstone, so I thought it was like a quarryman. And I'm looking at it and saying, no, that's a baseball bat. And I saw the other one had a baseball. And what kind of material is that made of?
This was more like an alloy metal, not iron. And this has become the most popular of all of them because the baseball collectors collect this one. They will knock the clock people out. They don't stand a chance at an auction.
Well, the detail on it, it's really, really beautiful. But I guess I saw the baseball players there, and then when I saw the two young boys that are up at the top, I was thinking like of the Hummels, and
Right.
that's what kind of, caught my eye. So, well, they got Hummels up there, and they got baseball players down there.
We're looking at here an interesting clock made by the Welch Spring and Company. Very high quality clocks, very difficult cases to make. They made these in different designs. This is one of the more desirable of the models because it's the miniature. There is an exact model that is designed the same way that sits up like this. Interestingly, this is an 8-day clock and very desirable with the collectors. They made wonderful clocks. They weren't that successful financially, but they did stay in business for a number of years. The last thing I want to point out in here, I'll pick this up, is America made a lot of cases with Royal Bond cases in porcelain, and the number of models that were made were prodigious, and this clock was produced in so many different colors, styles, and variation, and many of them have survived in tremendous condition because they're very susceptible, of course, to chipping and cracking and flaking. But this has become very desirable, and there's some collectors that specialize in these collections of porcelain clocks, and there's a great variety to collect. Wonderfully made, outside escapement. You see the escapements on the outside of the wheel, and high quality, fairly high quality movement.
Now, let me ask you something, Tom, before we move on to another. You can put that one back down there. I see all these different clocks and things. Now, do you accept clocks at the museum for anybody that wants to donate them for inclusion, into a collector's, display case or anything?
Right. We are constantly, thank you for asking, we are constantly having clocks donated to the American Clock and Watch Museum here in Bristol. And the reason it's so important is still important clocks are being found. We found one the other day. It was on a call, and it's an Eli Terry regulator that he made after he retired that we're saying, please donate that clock because it's so important to this Eli Terry story. So there are things out there like that. So we did buy at an auction last summer 4 major pieces of history that we didn't have in this clock due to the generosity of those that donate artifacts. With 2,200 clocks, we've got a lot, but we have a list of things that we would still like to acquire for the collection, but we can always use a clock here, and we accept donations of clocks, watches, memorabilia, books, anything collected to horology, we accept.
Okay, that's good to know. This will hear if somebody in our viewing audience has one or knows of somebody that has one and would like to be able to, to donate it. They know that they can find a good home for it, will be respected and treated with love, and be able to go and keep the history going forward for many more years to come.
Well, it's interesting because one of the donations that we accessioned some of the items into the collection were clocks that were made in the 50s. Previous to this, we considered those modern and not historic part of the story. Now they're part of the story. So we have a little collection of, for example, of the New England Clock Company out of Farmington, Connecticut here, which we grew up with them. So it's interesting when you live with a clock as you grow up, you don't tend to think of its importance in history. And then when you stop and think, those that record the history are the ones that are saving it for the future. These people that gave us this whole collection of this New England Clock Company, we're very thankful that we have it because we now have a representative collection of that company.
Okay, thank you.
Downstairs in the Ingram wing, we have various displays. One is of high-quality regulator clocks. We have a Howard Astral regulator in the corner, drumhead. Very beautiful. The movements in these clocks are of the highest standard. As we pan down the wall, we start to see a special regulator clock made by Simon Willard. And as we continue to expand the wall, we have Eli Terry's regulator with a very special movement that he designed. We have another Howard and Davis, and then a variant on the Howard number 36. This is one of the most remarkable carved clocks that we owned of the Victorian era. And as if we span down the wall, not to get into each one, we start to get into those that are what we call the electric watch clocks and slave and master clocks. And we have a history of that as we go around the room. And again, some high-quality regulators. In this particular case, we have a lot of the early tools that were used in clock making and watchmaking, and are genuine antiques, and were in the factories in production at one particular time. We also have a collection, a small collection of two of U.S. Navy clocks, this being the quartz model, which was the most accurate clock made in the 1950s. It is a quartz clock, and we believe it is the first clock that was made that could tell time more accurately than the Earth spinning on its axis. And so this was a major advance. There was only one other clock made that was more accurate, and we're going to look at that next. The clock that we had mentioned that was more accurate than the quartz clock is this particular clock. This is an atomic clock owned by the U.S. Naval Observatory, manufactured by Hewlett-Packard. This has a potentially very interesting history. We were told that this was one of the two clocks of the 12 made that were used to prove Einstein's theory of general relativity. And what they did was they took two of these clocks, they took one and put it in an jet and flew around the world. And Einstein says that the time on the clock will change because it's in acceleration. And when they landed after the trip around the world and looked at the two clocks, they were different by the amount predicted by Einstein's theory. Whether this particular one was the one of the two, we haven't been able to fully prove, but that's what was told to us by the donor. The other interesting aspect of this was that when MIT had their 150th anniversary that just closed a few months ago, they were looking for one of these atomic clocks, and they came to the American Clock and Watch Museum here in Bristol, and we had one of the clocks, and it was on loan for approximately a year for their display. So this clock has been potentially around the world and up to Massachusetts, and it is back home here in Bristol. The clock works on the measuring the outer electron on the cesium atom and its change in energy level. People that have don't understand the quantum theory thinks that the orbit of the electron changes. It's the energy level that changes. The position of it is not known in the quantum world. And what they did was they built this machine to measure that change in energy. And because the electron is so far away from the nucleus, being cesium is so large, it vibrates extremely rapidly, trillions of times a second. And that's why it's so accurate. When we received the clock, one of the most interesting things I asked is, well, could we recharge it and get it working? And the answer was, at the time of the donation, the estimate was $45,000 to recharge the cesium tank, and we decided not to do it.
Unless somebody's willing to make a donation of that amount.
Well, then we'd be radiated, so I don't know if we would start it up again. But here she sits. This is a wonderful piece of history, and we're so happy to have it here at the museum. The museum has a good collection of calendar clocks. This was really the last mechanical innovation of the mechanical clock in the 1800s. The first was by the Mix brothers and sold by Seth Thomas. The interesting thing about these calendar movements is that they are perpetual. They do keep track of whether there is 30 or 31 days in a month. And yes, when it hits February, it hits 29 or 28, and every fourth year it hits the 29th. So that way they're set once, and if you keep them running, they will run continuously and keep the right day and date and month automatically. Now the problem with the Mix Brothers movement was that the hour changed slowly. So you'd start to see the calendar hand move like at 10 o'clock, and it would take possibly an hour and a half to 2 hours to make the transition to the next day on the dial. And Ithaca came out not too long after, and we have an example of an Ithaca parlor clock, a very popular model. It does exactly the same thing as the Seth Thomas calendar clock, but what happens at 12 o'clock, you hear a ka-chink, and there's a cam in the back of the upper movement, and as the cam drops, everything changes, so it's instant. At 12 o'clock, the day, the date, and the month, if it's that time, will change within a second. And that was considered a pretty good improvement on the calendar clock. Now, there were other companies that developed competing calendar mechanisms. This one is by the Welch Spring and Company. And this is, as you can see, as the dial is more busy, it not only keeps track of the day, the time, the day of the month, it also has tides in and tides out, and also keeps track of the moon phases. This also is perpetual. There were 3 different calendar models that they produced, each movement having an improvement, and they're very highly collectible today. The next movement that we want to look at is housed in an Ingram clock, and this was also totally perpetual. But the difference in this calendar clock is that the whole mechanism is no bigger than 4 inches long and probably 1.5 to 2 inches wide. These other calendar mechanisms are anywhere from 6 to 8 inches and more to do the same thing that this movement that was patented by B.B. Lewis does the same thing, and was sort of the last major improvement in the calendar clocks. And so these became very popular and were sold in great quantity, and were a very fascinating part of the American history. This very interesting clock has this very large dial with these little ivory colored numbered segments. What this clock was a time clock to record the time worked at a factory.
Really?
So what a worker would have to do is they would have to find their number. If I were employee, let's say number 7, I would take this big wheel here and put it into the number 7 circle and push hard, and you would hear a bell. The bell's not functioning on this particular one. And that would clock you in and say, I started work at the time that you actually did that. Now this subwheel that's here does the same thing. What you have to do is it says, okay, lunch break, time out. So I move this to time out, take this, and punch number 7 again. And when I come back, I punch in that I came back in, and when I leave at night, I punch 7 again. Now inside this is a big roll of tape. Imagine you being the clerk and having 100 per day stamps on this time in, time out, lunch in, lunch out, break in, break out, and keep track of how many hours these guys worked. This is by the Day Recording Company. This is one of the earliest of these type of time clocks. It was quite convoluted, and I can't imagine a company having this be an efficient way to record time, but they were used for quite a period of time. We have another one here that handles 200 people, and we're just in the process of assembling this clock. This clock was just donated last month, so we haven't got it set up yet. But imagine doing 200 people. And
here's a book of instructions on
here's
it.
the book of instructions. So these time recorders, and they were made, the mechanical time recorders were made in quite a quantity and used throughout the United States.
This looked like a safe. That's why when I first saw that, that one I had no clue it was a time clock. And then this one, when I first looked at it, I said, gee, that looks like a unique safe.
Well, when you come around to the side, I'll let you see it. Maybe we can turn this around. And you can see the length of the roll of the paper that they're going to have to record and read on. I mean, it's astounding that they could spend the time to do that. Now, while we're here, if you want to just kind of span down this wall, this is the museum's collection of electrics. They're both battery operated, and some are electrical. There are what are called master clocks and slave clocks. There are watchman's clocks, where a watchman would have to go and punch in on the clock to prove that he was there, that he was making the rounds, and so that was all stamped out. As I say, we have master and slaves, and I was still in school, grade school, and if you remember the clock that was in the schoolroom, those of us that were of that era, you would see the minute hand start to click up a couple minutes and go right to the hour. Well, that was a signal from the master clock telling the slave to move up. And this is one of these, these clocks are those kind of clocks that were used as the masters to the slaves. And these could be wired to any number of slave clocks. In factories and schools especially use them. And this was in basically the later 1800s and 1900s. And you can see the case designs start to get more Spartan as time went on. You can almost date the clock by how plain the case is on these clocks. But very high quality, very good timekeepers, and very useful in the factories and in the schools.
Okay, so Tom, what exactly are we looking at right here?
We're looking at a 17th century, late 1600s clock from Europe. And this was a tower clock, iron frame. It is driven by a crown wheel, which is right at the very top of the movement. And the verge hits the crown wheel with the pendulum and keeps time. It did strike. It'll strike once on the hour, and as you see, there is no dial, and so this was probably housed in an area where the clock struck. People could hear it. They know the hours were advancing, but they couldn't see to tell exactly what time it was. This is probably our oldest clock in the museum, and it has been running very well for us. So these things were were made literally like iron, and they were made out of iron, and we see here that it's continuing to function and doing very well. What we're observing now is a clock that was made by Samuel Terry, brother of Eli Terry. This clock was made and donated to a church, a local church, in 1832, and it ran for almost 100 years and served faithfully, which shows that even though it was made out of wood, it was substantial, it worked, and it was faithful for almost a century. We have many other tower clocks here. We have a small collection of them down here in the basement of the Ingram wing, and also there are others throughout the collection. And these tower clocks, some wood, some made of metal, illustrate the entire history of the American tower clock. And we're very fortunate to have what we have here. Again, all of these clocks donated to the museum. What you're filming here is a Howard tower clock with a rare three-legged gravity escapement. This is a time-only tower clock movement. It was, rather than a verge and an escape wheel as typically found in these clocks, you see the fan moving and locking and unlocking. The fan is there to prevent the locking and unlocking slamming, and they act as a governor. And if you see the pendulum as it releases at the bottom of each one of those legs, there is hardly any friction that's involved here because it just goes side to side, releases the fan, and the clock is regulated by that whole process. This pendulum is 32 feet. We're driving this now, I think, with 350 pounds. And interestingly, we got this clock as a gift. And the story that went with it is that the people that had the clock didn't know what to do with it. And if we didn't take it, they were going to throw it out. And this is one of the most fabulous tower clocks ever produced in America. What you're looking at now is a Seth Thomas tower clock made in 1927 with an automatic wind. By this time, these tower clocks became available with the automatic wind because these were placed in positions that were difficult to get to. And so climbing a series of stairs and cranking on a movement to wind it, which would take you many, many turns, oftentimes it was very difficult. You couldn't get the clock winder, so they made this option of putting a motor on it which would automatically wind the weights when the weights got too low and would hit a contact, and then it would raise it. This is very noisy, and we may hear this at some time as we are going throughout this room. It's a very loud cranking noise, and usually most people jump when they hear this. It's so loud. But this was an adaptation that was made in the 1900s and sold and advertised in the catalogs with the motor as the option.
Yeah, I think, Al, you might want to get a side view here, because one of the pieces that are going in with the wheel there, it almost looks like a sledgehammer that it takes right in between.
Oh, this right
Yeah,
here?
that piece is, you know, when you're looking at it from a layman's point of view.
Yeah, the sledgehammer is called a verge.
Well, I was given the technical name.
Right. What you're focusing on here is what the clock people call the escape wheel and the verge. This is what does the tick-tocking sound. There's an entry, which is the tick, and the exit, which is the tock, and that's what controls the release of the train, so that if that weren't there, what would happen is the weight would just fall down. This actually controls the timing of the weight dropping, which is translated into the front, which is the dial, which then tells the time. Now, most escape wheels are of brass, and most of the verges are of steel, and often we see the soft brass wear the steel. And the reason is because the brass gets dirty, and the dust and the dirt get embedded right into the brass, and it acts as a file. So that's why clocks need to be maintained routinely, cleaned, and re-oiled.
Okay, Jennifer, we really want to thank you. We had a wonderful visit here and learned so much, and just couldn't believe the wealth of knowledge that you have in Tom. We were talking about jewels. Well, he definitely is a jewel of the American Clock and Watch Museum.
Yeah, absolutely.
For sure. And I know that there's other things that you'd like to tell us as we wrap up our tour. So.
Yeah, well, one of the things we would love it if people would come and visit, and we're so thrilled that you got into the history as much as you did and stayed and visited with us as long as you did. And there is a lot to see, and that's one of the things that people say when they come is we can't believe how much there is here. So we really ask people to plan an hour or more to come and visit the museum. And we're opening for the season, we're open generally April through November. For 2012 season, we're open April 14th through December 2nd, and that will be 7 days a week from 10 in the morning to 5 in the evening. And aside from that, admission, our prices are very reasonable. Adult admission is $5, and children is $2, I believe. So it's a family, affordable kind of
Absolutely.
outing for people. One of the other things is what happens when people come here, what can they expect? We don't always have Tom Grimshaw, our curator,
I know, we
available.
were very, very fortunate, and we do thank you for that.
But if you can rope them into a personal tour. But when people come here, they have options. We have 8 galleries, as you've seen, and people have the option of a self-guided tour. With that, there's also, we do periodically, we try to do every week, timed guided tours, so that people who want to have that person that come and explain the history and what they're looking at can have that as well. But we also have the interpretive panels in every gallery. For families, we have a scavenger hunt, so kids really get into, and parents really get into doing the scavenger hunt, which takes you through the galleries. And we also have a cell phone audio tour, which is free with the price of admission. So people are given a map and certain sites they can call in from their cell phone and learn more about a particular item, which is also a popular thing that we have. One of the other things I mentioned is that we have a lot of programs throughout the year. I mentioned we're open April 14th to December 2nd, but if people are dying to get in here in the off season, we're dying to make that possible. So we do schedule by appointment. Anyone can come for a visit, group tours, anything. We accommodate anybody as much as possible. We also do programs throughout the year, not necessarily just in our open season. And some of that includes a family workshop series, like how to build a family time capsule, activities that families can do together, or building a clock, making a clock together. We have periodic clock and watch identification days, which are very popular, where people can bring in an item and we have experts on hand to tell you more about that item to help date it or lead you in the direction for finding more information. We do that on a quarterly basis, so that people regularly have something to look forward to. Another item is that we have changing exhibition. Every year we're doing a changing exhibition. For 2012, we're focusing on what was happening in the early 1950s with the establishment of the museum, looking at what was happening in the community of Bristol and on a national level that affected the clock and watch industry. That exhibit's entitled TV War and Cinderella, and we'll have loans from the community and from some area museums, and we're very excited about that one as well. Another thing is special events. Every year we have our annual wine tasting. This year we're kicking off our first annual cupcake bake-off, which we've been affectionately calling the Betty Clocker Cupcake Bake-Off. So just to get new ways to get people in. And one of the ways that we do that too is by renting our facility. We've had weddings here, business meetings. We invite various groups to use our space. The Barnes Wing is set up as a great function space. And we also have a colonial garden that we haven't been able to see, but the garden is available as well for small.
Well, there was only so much we could do
That's right.
here at that point.
We can't show it all.
And all we're doing is we're trying to whet the appetite
Yeah.
for the viewing audience so they can see is what we've shown them. There's just so much more, and they really need to come here and to experience themselves. And I'll tell you, I think they need more than an hour, because if you come with your children or anything, there's just so much to see. The hands-on, you see the displays, the history that's there. It to me,
Absolutely.
I think it's a nice afternoon to be able to plan for a family event. But I wanted to ask you, do you have a website that you would list some of these things for updates?
As a matter of fact, we do.
Good.
It's clockandwatchmuseum.org. Very easy to find, to Google it to find it. And that has a list of all of our programs. It also has ways in which people can get involved. Of course, we'd love everyone to give to the annual fund drive and those sorts of things. But we're looking for volunteers for various types of activities. And we have an Adopt a Clock program as one of the ways that people can help support us. With the Adopt a Clock program for $250, a family or an individual can pick out a clock in the museum that's theirs for the year. It stays in the museum, but what it's doing is giving us the funds to help support the preservation and care of the collection that we have. And so we have businesses that do it as well. And then every year you get a letter from your clock with a photo telling you about how things went for the year. So it's a fun program that we have, and it's growing every year. So get a clock while you still can. We only have a few thousand.
Well, Jennifer, thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure
Yes,
coming
thank you so much
here.
for coming.
And we thank you for inviting us into your home and sharing Tom with us, giving us the opportunity. He spent so many hours with us, and it's just such a joy. I got so excited. I never knew I could get so excited about clocks and the history, and I said, rah, rah, America, and I'm just going all the way through, and Tom was just such a joy, and I'm sure you're going to have a lot of people coming by to see, because what we just did was the tip of the iceberg, and everybody, when they come, they will prove us right that this is definitely a jewel within the city.
Great, thank you.
Okay, thank you.